The historical study of Greek mythology begins with the administrative and archaeological evidence of the late Bronze Age Greek world. Between 1600 and 1400 BC, the society known as the Mycenaean civilization developed across the Greek mainland and parts of Crete. This period marks the formation of a structured political order built around palace complexes at Mycenae, Pylos, Knossos, Thebes, and Tiryns. These centers administered land, labor, and long-distance trade networks, and they maintained organized cult practices. Although written myths do not survive from this period, the Mycenaean world provides the first datable framework within which Greek gods can be documented. The earliest secure appearance of Greek divine names does not occur at the beginning of the Mycenaean era, but somewhat later from around 1450 BC onward, when scribes recorded economic transactions on clay tablets using the script known today as Linear B. This writing system was used strictly for administrative accounting. It lists commodities, workforce distributions, livestock counts, storage inventories, and allocations for ritual purposes. Because Linear B was not used for poetry or narrative writing, no myths survive from this period. Yet these tablets provide the first clear, datable evidence of Greek gods, establishing the foundation of the historical timeline for Greek mythology. The tablets record several divine names that correspond to deities known from later Greek religion. These include Zeus, commonly written as Diwa or Dyjo, Hera, Yare, Poseidon, Poseini, and Ares, Ari. Some other names are present that may correspond to later Olympian gods, but scholars classify them cautiously. For example, forms sometimes interpreted as early references to Dionysus or Hermes appear in a few fragments, but the readings are debated due to partial signs and regional variation. Similarly, the name Aetna appears at Knossos and may relate to a divinity later identified as Athena, but the Mycenaean context does not allow us to assume the later classical attributes or narrative identity. These variations reflect the complexity of Bronze Age religion and the fact that not all deities were uniformly recognized across regions. The Linear B tablets document the gods not through myth, but through economic entries. They receive allocations of wine, oil, barley, textiles, and livestock dedicated for ritual purposes. Some tablets describe the number of sheep or goats assigned for sacrifice. Others record aromatics or manufactured goods destined for sanctuaries. This consistent, quantifiable structure demonstrates that religious activity was integrated into the palace economy. Ritual offerings were not spontaneous acts, but part of a centralized redistributive system controlled by palace administrators. One of the notable observations in Linear B material is the prominence of Poseidon in several archives. At Pylos, for example, multiple tablets reference offerings to Poseidon or to sanctuaries under his name. His prominence does not automatically imply universal dominance across the Mycenaean world, but it does indicate that he held a significant position in certain regions. This pattern highlights a key point about Mycenaean religion. There was no single standardized pantheon. Different regions emphasized different deities, and cult importance varied by site and administrative structure. The tablets also reference religious officials, including priests, IGU, and priestesses, Igurija. These individuals appear in contexts indicating oversight of sanctuaries and participation in ritual activities. Their presence confirms that Mycenaean religion featured structured religious offices operating within the broader palatial administrative system. Religious practice, economic management, and political authority were interconnected, and rituals required resources controlled by the palace. Archaeological remains complement the textual material. At Mycenae, small shrines and cult rooms have been uncovered containing clay figurines, seated idols, and ritual vessels. At Pylos, frescoes show ceremonial scenes such as processions and gatherings around decorated altars. The Room of the Chariot tablets at Knossos yielded numerous documents related to administrative and ritual matters. Although none of these visual materials include inscriptions identifying specific gods, their association with palace complexes demonstrates that ritual activity was a recognized component of state function. Mycenaean religious architecture had not yet developed the standardized temple form known from later Greek history. Instead, cult activity took place in varied settings: small rooms within palaces, standalone shrines, open courtyards, and domestic structures adapted for ritual use. Archaeologists have identified altars, hearths, offering tables, and pits filled with animal bones showing signs of burning. These findings indicate that sacrificial practices were common and that ritual procedures followed consistent patterns, even if architectural forms were not yet uniform. Symbolic objects found in Mycenaean ritual contexts, such as double axes, horns of consecration, and figurines with raised arms, demonstrate cultural continuity from earlier Aegean traditions, especially from Minoan Crete. However, the functions and meanings of these symbols likely evolved as they were incorporated into new political and religious frameworks. Their presence indicates adoption and adaptation rather than direct continuity of belief. Some Linear B tablets also include divine names that do not survive into later Greek religion. For example, references to minor or local deities appear in certain administrative lists, showing that the Bronze Age pantheon was broader than the Olympian system known from later periods. This suggests that part of the evolution from Mycenaean to classical Greek religion involved selective continuity, in which some deities were preserved while others disappeared. Burial evidence from the Mycenaean era provides additional context. Shaft graves, tholos tombs, and chamber tombs contain weapons, jewelry, seals, and pottery. Many graves show evidence of funerary rites involving offerings or repeated visitation. Although these materials do not give explicit details about beliefs regarding the afterlife, they indicate that Mycenaean communities practiced organized burial rituals. Later Greek conceptions of the dead cannot be directly mapped onto this evidence, but the presence of structured funerary practice highlights long-standing ritual concern for the deceased. The Mycenaean economy operated through a redistributive model in which goods collected from surrounding regions were stored in palace warehouses and redistributed for administrative, military, and religious use. Offerings to the gods formed part of this system. Tablets listing grain, textiles, or livestock for sanctuaries show that ritual activity relied on palace-controlled resources. Religion was therefore embedded within the governing structure of Mycenaean society, not separate from it. By 1400 BC, Mycenaean palaces had expanded their administrative reach and established complex bureaucracies. Many surviving Linear B tablets come from destruction layers, where fires hardened the clay and preserved the inscriptions. This pattern of survival reflects the archaeological reality of the period. Most tablets were unbaked when in use and became durable only when exposed to intense heat during palace destruction events. Preservation conditions differed by site, but destruction by fire is a common factor in several major archives. A major turning point in modern scholarship occurred in 1952 when Michael Ventris, working with scholar John Chadwick, deciphered Linear B and demonstrated that the script recorded an early form of Greek. This discovery allowed researchers to identify divine names and economic terminology that connect the Mycenaean world to later Greek religion. Ventris' decipherment established the first direct link between the Bronze Age palatial world and the literary mythology of the first millennium BC. Between 1400 and 1200 BC, the Mycenaean palatial system reached its height across mainland Greece and parts of Crete. This period represents the most developed phase of Bronze Age Greek religion before the collapse of the palatial world near the end of the 13th century BC. It is during these centuries that the administrative, cultic, and architectural structures governing worship became thoroughly integrated into the palatial economy. Although written myths do not survive from this era, the evidence from Linear B tablets, shrines, frescoes, and ritual deposits allows for a reliable reconstruction of the religious practices that formed the proto-structure of later Greek mythology. The Linear B archives from this period contain the largest volume of surviving tablets from the Mycenaean world. The earliest large corpus comes from Knossos, dating to the late 15th century BC, and later archives appear at Pylos, Mycenae, Thebes, and Chania in the 13th to 12th centuries BC. The Pylos archive, for example, consists of roughly 1,100 tablets recovered from destruction layers associated with the final decades of the palace. These tablets provide the clearest administrative record of Mycenaean cult activity. They document religious offerings in quantities that can be measured, allocations of sheep and goats, jars of oil, containers of honey, measures of grain, and numbers of textiles designated for sanctuaries. This documentation reflects a structured system in which religious practice operated as part of state-controlled redistribution. Several divine names recorded in these tablets match those known from later Greek religion. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Ares, and possibly Hermes or Dionysus appear in various forms, though not uniformly across sites. The spelling of these names varies by archive, and some are fragmentary or debated. For instance, Etana, found at Knossos, may refer to a deity later known as Athena, but the Mycenaean evidence does not support later classical associations. Some tablets also include divine names not preserved in later Greek tradition, reflecting the broader and more regionally varied pantheon of the Bronze Age. The appearance of these names in administrative texts confirms the existence of organized cults, but does not provide narrative content associated with them. The palaces themselves served as administrative hubs overseeing all aspects of economic and religious life. Offerings to the gods were not personal donations. They were recorded as part of palace accounting. Tablets from Pylos list the quantities of oil allocated for use in ritual ceremonies. Others record sheep designated for sacrifice, sometimes in groups of 3, 7, or 9. These numbers appear repeated enough to indicate standardized ritual procedures rather than isolated acts. At Mycenae and Thebes, similar tablets record honey and wine offerings intended for divine recipients. The consistent categories of goods, livestock, oil, wine, textiles, and agricultural products show that religious activity followed established patterns supported by state resources. Mycenaean religious officials appear frequently in Linear B texts. Titles such as Igiriou, priest, and Igirija, priestess, denote individuals responsible for overseeing sanctuaries and participating in ritual activity. These officials received distributions of food or textiles as part of their service. In some cases, tablets record personnel associated with specific sanctuaries, indicating that particular shrines had dedicated administrative oversight. Their presence shows that priesthoods formed an integral part of palatial administration rather than an independent religious class. The roles were likely hereditary or tied to elite families, but the tablets do not describe personal status, belief, or social influence. The architectural remains from this period provide important physical context for ritual practice. Mycenaean shrines and cult rooms appear in varied forms. Some were located within palace complexes, such as the shrines attached to the main halls at Mycenae and Tiryns. Others were freestanding structures outside palace walls. Many shrines consist of small rooms containing terracotta figurines, offering tables, or stone baetylic pillars. Excavations at Mycenae uncovered figurines with raised arms, seated idols, and model altars. These objects appear repeatedly in Mycenaean religious spaces, suggesting that ritual display and offering were consistent practices across regions. Frescoes from sites such as Knossos and Pylos depict scenes associated with ritual, though their exact interpretations remain uncertain. Many frescoes show processions of figures carrying vessels, approaching altars, or wearing ceremonial garments. These images depict activities, not narratives. Without inscriptions, they cannot be linked to specific deities or mythic events. Their value lies in documenting the ceremonial environments of the period, which later Greek religion would no longer replicate in the same artistic style. One notable feature of Mycenaean religious practice is the absence of standardized temple architecture. Later Greek religion is characterized by stone temples built on raised platforms, with columned facades and fixed interior layouts. In contrast, Mycenaean cult spaces are small, varied in design, and often embedded within administrative buildings. This suggests that palatial religion emphasized the functional relationship between cult and governance. Rituals were integrated into palace life rather than separated into distinct monumental structures. Outdoor altars, hearths, or small shrines appear in multiple contexts, reflecting the flexibility of Mycenaean cult practice. Sacrificial activity formed an important part of religious practice. Excavations of animal bone deposits show patterns of burning and butchering consistent with ritual procedures. At Pylos, deposits associated with feasting or communal sacrifice include cattle, sheep, and goats. Although the tablets record numerous livestock offerings, they do not provide details about the ritual sequence, participants, or ceremonial meaning. Archaeological evidence confirms that sacrifices occurred, but the exact rites remain unknown due to the absence of descriptive texts. Mycenaean religion also incorporated inherited symbols from earlier Aegean cultures, especially from the Minoan civilization of Crete. Double axes, horns of consecration, and figurines with upraised arms appear in shrines at Knossos, Mycenae, and other sites. These symbols existed in the region before the Mycenaeans adopted writing, and their appearance in Mycenaean contexts demonstrates continuity of ritual objects rather than continuity of myth. Their functions likely evolved as they were adapted into Mycenaean cult environments. These objects cannot be linked directly to specific gods or stories. Foreign contact during this period extended across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery appears in Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt, and imported goods such as ostrich shell vessels or faience objects appear in Mycenaean palaces. These exchanges demonstrate economic links, but the available evidence does not confirm direct adoption of foreign religious ideas. Similarities in iconography between Mycenaean and Near Eastern motifs exist, but they cannot be interpreted as borrowed myths. The documentary approach requires limiting statements to verifiable interactions supported by archaeological evidence. The palatial economy structured worship as part of a broader administrative system. Goods assigned to shrines were drawn from palace-controlled resources, and priestly personnel were allocated rations and textiles according to bureaucratic procedure. Some tablets record specific sanctuaries by name, indicating organized regional cult centers under palace oversight. These sanctuaries likely served as focal points for community gatherings or seasonal rituals. The tablets do not describe ceremonies, but the consistency of allocations suggests routine, institutionally supported worship. Another important feature of this period is the presence of divine names in tablet lists that do not appear in later Greek religion. These names represent local or regional deities whose worship did not survive into the Iron Age. Their presence shows that the Mycenaean pantheon was broader and less standardized than the later Olympian system. This wide range of divine names also indicates that later Greek mythology reflects only part of the Bronze Age religious landscape. The transformation from the Mycenaean pantheon to the classical one involved both continuity and loss. Ritual deposits from Mycenaean shrines provide further insight into religious practice. At several sites, archaeologists have uncovered pits containing pottery, figurines, and animal bones. These deposits suggest that offerings were placed and retired in specific ritual contexts. Figurines appear in large numbers and often include female forms, animals, or abstract shapes. Their exact meaning remains uncertain, but their repetition across sites indicates consistent ritual use. They cannot be assigned to specific mythological characters, but represent a material component of worship during the period. Burial practices remained formalized throughout the Mycenaean era. Tholos tombs and chamber tombs show continuity of funerary customs involving grave goods and repeated visitation. These practices indicate structured beliefs about death, although the details cannot be recovered from surviving evidence. There is no written material describing the afterlife, so later Greek concepts must not be projected backward. The archaeological record only shows that Mycenaean communities performed ritual actions to honor the deceased. By 1200 BC, the Mycenaean palatial system was still functioning, though signs of stress appear in some regions. The height of religious organization occurred during the 14th and 13th centuries BC, when the administrative and ritual structures were most fully developed. Worship at this time followed established procedures, involved dedicated personnel, and relied on palace resources. Although no myths were written during this period, the cult practices documented in the tablets and the associated archaeological remains form the proto-structure of the mythological framework that later Greek tradition would describe in narrative form. Between 1200 and 1100 BC, the Mycenaean palatial system that had dominated Greece for centuries entered a period of profound disruption. This century marks the transition from a highly organized palace-based society, supported by administrative writing and centralized economic structures, to a decentralized landscape where population decline, site abandonment, and shifts in settlement patterns reshaped the religious and cultural environment. The collapse did not occur at a single moment, nor did it affect all regions equally. Instead, archaeological evidence shows a series of destruction events, structural failures, and economic contractions that unfolded across different sites over several decades. The palatial system's weakening becomes visible around c. 1200 BC, though earlier episodes of stress may have occurred in the late 13th century. The archaeological record presents a pattern of burned or abandoned palaces, including Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes, with destruction horizons dated between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC. The causes of these destructive events remain debated. Proposed explanations include earthquakes, internal conflicts, warfare, systemic economic strain, and disruptions to long-distance trade routes. No single cause explains the collapse of all sites. The evidence indicates that multiple factors likely contributed to the end of the palatial administrative system. As palaces fell, the Linear B writing system disappeared along with them. Linear B had been used exclusively for palace administration. Because it depended on a trained class of scribes supported by central institutions, the destruction of those institutions meant the sudden end of literacy. The writing system was not adapted for broader public use and left no successor form. This disappearance marks a significant shift. The administrative documentation that had preserved records of offerings, priestly offices, and cult infrastructure came to an abrupt halt. Without the palace-supported scribal apparatus, there is no written record of religious activity for the following centuries. The collapse of palace economies also meant the end of the redistributive system that had supported organized cult practice. During the height of the Mycenaean period, offerings of livestock, grain, oil, and textiles were recorded and regulated by palace administrators. Shrines often received goods allocated through bureaucratic channels. Once the palaces ceased functioning, these offerings no longer flowed through centralized mechanisms. Religious practice continued, but it shifted to a local, community-based scale without the economic resources or administrative consistency that had defined earlier worship. Archaeological evidence from the period after the destruction of the palaces shows continued occupation in some settlements. However, the scale of activity changed significantly. Many sites were either reduced in size or abandoned entirely. At some locations, small communities reoccupied areas near former palaces, but without reconstructing the administrative or architectural complexity of earlier periods. Burial patterns also changed, with some tholos tombs falling out of use and new, simpler burial forms appearing. These developments indicate a reorganization of social structures, not cultural extinction. Religious activity persisted during this transitional period, but in forms that are archaeologically visible rather than textually recorded. Shrines previously attached to palaces lost their institutional support. In some areas, votive offerings and ritual deposits continued, though at smaller scales. Terracotta figurines, miniature vessels, and animal remains appear in post-destruction layers at several sites, suggesting continuity of ritual practice. However, without written records, the organizational structure of worship is largely unknown. The absence of administrative inscriptions means the gods recorded in Linear B cannot be linked with certainty to specific post-palatial shrines or ritual deposits. The regional variation in collapse is an important feature of this period. Pylos, for example, was destroyed by fire around c. 1180 BC, with its archives preserved in the destruction layer. After this event, The site was not rebuilt as a palace center. Mycenae suffered destruction but saw limited reoccupation. Tiryns displays evidence of continued life and partial rebuilding in the following century. Knossos, which had lost palatial dominance earlier, experienced different patterns of decline. These differences demonstrate that the collapse was not uniform across Greece. Each region adapted in its own way to the loss of centralized authority. The disruption of the palatial system also affected long-distance trade. Mycenaean pottery, which had previously circulated widely across the eastern Mediterranean, appears in lower quantities after 1200 BC. Imports likewise decline, suggesting reduced connectivity with Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt. This reduction in trade likely affected resource availability, including materials previously used in ritual offerings. The religious practices visible in the archaeological record reflect increased localism and decreased access to specialized goods. As the administrative system disappeared, so too did the priestly offices supported by the palace. Titles such as Igu, priest, and Igerija, priestess, which had appeared in Linear B documents, likely ceased to exist in their earlier institutional form. This does not mean the end of religious specialists, but rather the end of state-supported religious personnel documented by writing. Without administrative oversight, religious roles would have reorganized at the community level, possibly with local families or leaders maintaining shrines and rituals. The evidence cannot confirm specific roles, but the disappearance of administrative titles signals a significant restructuring of religious labor. One of the most important results of the collapse was the shift from written administrative preservation of religious life to oral memory as the primary mode of transmission. This does not imply the creation of myths at this time, nor does it indicate that particular stories originated in this century. Instead, the collapse created a condition in which knowledge previously recorded in writing could only be preserved through speech, ritual practice, and communal repetition. Over time, this change in preservation method would influence how religious ideas evolved, though evidence from this period cannot specify narrative content. The collapse also altered settlement patterns. Many large sites diminished in size, and smaller, more defensible sites became more common. This shift has implications for religious practice, as smaller communities would have managed their own ritual spaces without reliance on a central authority. Archaeological remains from the century following the collapse show continuity in votive figurines and ritual deposits, suggesting that earlier practices persisted in modified form. The gods named in Linear B do not disappear from religious memory, but without written records, their worship becomes archaeologically visible only through general evidence of continued ritual activity. This period should not be interpreted as a cultural void. Although the palatial system ended, the Greek language continued in spoken form. Pottery styles evolved but retained recognizable features. Burial customs continued with variations. Communities adapted to new social and economic realities without losing their identity. The later Greek tradition, emerging centuries afterward, remembered the Mycenaean world as a distant past marked by large structures, powerful rulers, and significant events. However, these later memories do not provide direct information about the collapse itself. In assessing this period, it is important to distinguish between destruction and transformation. The collapse marks the end of palatial administration, not the disappearance of the Greek people or their religious traditions. What changed was the scale and structure of religious practice, not the existence of worship itself. Shrines may have continued in use, though in an altered form. Offerings continued, though without administrative documentation. Oral transmission replaced written accounting, laying the foundation for later developments in Greek cultural memory. By 1100 BC, the major palatial centers of Greece no longer functioned as administrative hubs. The Linear B writing system had disappeared. Cult activity persisted at local levels, and settlement patterns reflected a decentralized society adjusting to new conditions. This century represents a transitional phase between the structured religious economy of the Mycenaean world and the fully oral, community-based traditions of the following Greek Dark Age. The collapse of the palatial system thus marks a turning point in the long historical development of Greek mythology. The gods attested in Linear B do not vanish, but the manner in which religious knowledge is preserved changes fundamentally. This shift, from written administration to oral tradition, creates the conditions under which later mythic narratives could evolve, even though no such narratives can be traced directly to this period. Between 1100 and 900 BC, Greece entered a period commonly referred to as the Greek Dark Age, defined not by complete cultural absence, but by the loss of palace administration, the disappearance of writing, and the shift to small, decentralized communities. This period stands at the midpoint between the fall of the Mycenaean palatial world and the later re-emergence of complex Greek society in the early 1st millennium BC. It is also during these centuries that religious memory transitioned from a system supported by administrative writing to one sustained entirely through oral transmission. The defining characteristic of this period is the absence of writing. After the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces around 1200 to 1150 BC, the Linear B writing system vanished. The scribes who used it were connected to palace administration, and with the end of that system, literacy ceased. No writing appears again in the Greek world until the adoption of the alphabet several centuries later. This gap has significant implications for the preservation of religious and cultural knowledge. The detailed records that previously documented offerings, personnel, and cult activities no longer exist. Everything transmitted during this period, ritual procedures, genealogical knowledge, and traditional stories, was preserved solely in oral form, leaving no contemporary written evidence. Archaeological evidence shows that the population of Greece declined significantly after the collapse of the palaces. Many large sites were abandoned or reduced to small settlements. In regions like the Argolid, Messenia, and Boeotia, settlement density decreased, and surviving communities often relocated to more defensible or resource-efficient areas. While population decline was evident, it was not uniform across all regions. Some areas, such as parts of Attica and Euboea, show relative continuity or even growth over time. This regional variation underscores that the Dark Age was not a single, homogeneous experience, but a diverse set of local adaptations to post-palatial conditions. Religious practice continued, though in simpler and more localized forms than during the Mycenaean period. Shrines associated with palace complexes lost their institutional support, but ritual activity persisted in smaller community contexts. Archaeological remains from this period include open-air sanctuaries, simple altars, and votive offerings such as terracotta figurines and small pottery vessels. These items demonstrate that communities maintained ritual practices even without the administrative oversight previously documented in Linear B tablets. Although the identities of the gods worshipped cannot be securely determined, The material continuity from earlier periods suggests that religious traditions did not disappear, even if their organization changed significantly. Pottery provides one of the most important archaeological indicators of cultural continuity and change during these centuries. The styles of the early Iron Age, including proto-geometric pottery beginning around 1050 to 1000 BC, show significant technological and aesthetic development. These pottery forms mark the beginning of a new artistic phase, characterized by precise geometric patterns and improved craftsmanship resulting from advances in the fast wheel. The emergence of proto-geometric pottery indicates a degree of stability and craft specialization within communities, even during a period of reduced population and decentralized political structure. Burial practices also offer insight into cultural developments. Following the collapse of the palaces, burial customs shifted from elaborate tholos tombs to simpler inhumation and cremation practices. Cemeteries from this period, such as those at Lefkandi on Euboea, show continuity in ritual respect for the dead and occasional use of high-quality grave goods, including imported materials. Lefkandi, in particular, stands out as an example of a community that maintained considerable social complexity. Excavations at the Tumba building at Lefkandi revealed a large structure with a central burial, accompanied by valuable goods, indicating that hierarchical social organization persisted even during the Dark Age. However, such sites are exceptions rather than typical for the entire region. With the loss of administrative writing, the preservation of cultural memory relied entirely on oral transmission. This does not mean that fixed narratives existed during this period. Instead, traditions were fluid, localized, and shaped by the needs of individual communities. Genealogies, ritual practices, and historical recollections would have been passed down through speech, performance, and communal gatherings. Because no written texts survive, the specific content of oral traditions from this century cannot be reconstructed. However, the continuity of religious practice, burial customs, and communal rituals suggests that memory of the past remained active within Greek society. The shift from written to oral memory had long-term consequences for the development of Greek mythology. The administrative lists of the Mycenaean period, which recorded divine names and cult allocations, were no longer preserved in tangible form. Over time, these earlier traditions would survive as remembered fragments of a distant past, eventually becoming raw material for later narrative structures. It is important, however, not to project later Greek myths back onto this period. The oral traditions of 1100 to 900 BC cannot be identified with the heroic cycles known from classical literature. The figures and storylines associated with the later Trojan War tradition or the adventures of heroic figures are not attested here. What existed instead was a broad environment in which memory persisted without a standardized form. Settlement patterns during this period reflect the decentralized nature of society. Communities tended to be small, often located on elevated or defensible terrain. Houses were built with simpler plans compared to the elaborate structures of the Mycenaean period. Agricultural activity remained central to survival, with evidence for animal husbandry, cereal cultivation, and localized craft production. The absence of large-scale economic networks meant that each community operated with limited external support. Trade did not disappear entirely. Some imported goods appear in sites such as Lefkandi, but the scale was far smaller than in the palatial era. Despite population decline and reduced trade, connections between certain regions persisted. Euboea, for example, maintained contact with Cyprus and the Near East, as seen through the presence of imported materials. These contact points suggest that while Greece was generally more isolated during the Dark Age, select communities maintained external relationships. These connections may have contributed to the eventual re-emergence of broader cultural networks in later centuries. Ritual continuity can also be observed through the persistence of certain votive practices. Terracotta figurines, especially simple human or animal forms, appear in many Dark Age contexts. These figurines continue earlier Mycenaean patterns of ritual deposition, though in simplified form. The repetition of these offerings across regions indicates a shared cultural habit of marking sacred spaces, even without the administrative structures previously associated with worship. The identities of the deities receiving these offerings cannot be determined, but the continuity in ritual form demonstrates the endurance of religious traditions. Another significant feature of the Dark Age is the lack of monumental construction. Large-scale buildings, stone temples, and formal sanctuaries do not appear during this period. Instead, communities used small shrines or open-air spaces for ritual activity. The absence of monumental architecture reflects the limited economic resources and smaller population sizes of the era. It also emphasizes the fundamentally local character of worship during these centuries. The oral transmission of memory during this period provided the framework for later developments in Greek mythology, but it cannot be described in detail. Oral tradition is inherently flexible, and without written texts, it is impossible to determine the specific stories or themes that circulated during this time. What can be said is that the cultural environment that later produced the epic tradition was shaped by centuries of oral preservation. The lack of writing did not eliminate memory. It simply altered the medium through which memory was carried forward. By 900 BC, signs of recovery and reorganization begin to appear. Population levels started to stabilize, settlements grew larger, and material culture became more diverse. Proto-geometric pottery spread widely, indicating increased craft specialization. Some communities began to establish more permanent structures and reoccupy earlier sites. These developments marked the gradual transition from the decentralized society of the Dark Age to the more interconnected world of the Early Iron Age. This century of oral memory and decentralized religious practice forms a crucial stage in the long historical development of Greek mythology. Although no identifiable myths or heroes can be traced to this era, the shift from palatial administration to oral tradition created the conditions under which later mythic cycles could eventually form. Between 900 and 800 BC, Greece experienced a gradual and measurable rebound from the fragmentation and population decline that defined the earlier Dark Age. This century marks the beginning of a slow reorganization of society, the re-establishment of broader regional interaction, and the emergence of communal frameworks that would, over time, allow oral traditions to converge across distances. While myths in the later familiar sense were not yet recorded or standardized, the structural environment in which traditions could move between communities began forming during this period. The archaeological record shows that population levels started to increase after reaching their lowest point around the 11th century BC. Settlement sites that had been abandoned or reduced in size during the 12th and 11th centuries became reoccupied, and some expanded gradually. Regions such as Attica, Euboea, parts of central Greece, and the Aegean Islands show signs of demographic and economic growth. This increase was not uniform. Some mainland regions remained sparsely populated, but the overall trend indicates that communities were stabilizing and reorganizing after centuries of decentralized living. This period is marked by the continued development and spread of proto-geometric pottery, which first emerged near the end of the previous century. By 900 BC, proto-geometric pottery was widely produced across several regions. The characteristic precision of its geometric patterns and the technological improvement in firing techniques, especially the use of the fast wheel, reflect the re-establishment of specialized craftsmanship. The expansion of these pottery styles indicates the presence of skilled artisans, consistent production networks, and growing interregional exchange. Trade contacts, while limited compared to the Mycenaean Bronze Age, demonstrate clear signs of renewal. Imported goods, particularly from the Near East and Cyprus, begin to appear more frequently in graves and settlements. Sites such as Lefkandi on Euboea show substantial evidence of foreign contact, including items made from bronze, faience, and glass. These finds reflect a slow but steady re-engagement with maritime networks across the eastern Mediterranean. The trade was modest in scale, but represented a significant shift from the relative isolation of the early Dark Age. The re-emergence of communal sanctuaries is one of the most notable developments between 900 and 800 BC. These sanctuaries were not monumental temples, nor were they pan-Hellenic centers in the later sense. Instead, they were modest, regionally important places where communities gathered for ritual activity. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Drairos in Crete, Nicoria in Messenia, and early levels at Olympia shows that religious activity became increasingly organized at the community level. These sanctuaries included simple altars, open-air spaces for offerings, and sometimes small buildings used for ritual purposes. The increasing prominence of communal sanctuaries reflects a critical structural change. Instead of religion being confined to small household shrines or local sacred spots, it began to take on a larger social function. People from nearby settlements could converge periodically for ritual observances, reinforcing shared practices. However, the identities of the deities worshipped at these early sanctuaries are not always clear, and the gods are not yet tied to later classical mythological systems. What is evident is that ritual space was becoming one of the first stable frameworks in which separate communities could interact more consistently. The strengthening of inter-community interaction is also visible in evolving social organization. Settlements grew more cohesive, and some began to take on early structural features that would eventually define the polis, though the polis itself does not fully develop until the 8th and 7th centuries BC. These early communities exhibit signs of leadership roles, the presence of communal gathering spaces, and increased coordination of labor for building projects, such as storage facilities or fortifications. These developments signal the beginning stages of political consolidation, even though formal state structures did not yet exist. Religious practices during this period remained rooted in earlier traditions, but they were now shaped by the social reorganization underway. Shrines at sites such as Drairos show evidence of statues placed in simple temple-like buildings. One of the earliest known examples of a cult structure resembling a later Greek temple, though still very modest in scale. Ritual offerings, including terracotta figurines, pottery, and small metal objects, appear in greater quantities than in the preceding century. These practices indicate that as communities grew more stable, the resources and personnel needed to maintain regular ritual activity also increased. The role of oral tradition expanded during this period, although no written texts exist to document its content. With the disappearance of writing centuries earlier, oral communication remained the only means of transmitting stories, genealogies, religious traditions, and communal histories. As communities began interacting more frequently, these oral traditions could move from one region to another, gradually allowing shared frameworks to emerge. However, it is essential not to project later mythological structures onto this period. The stories that would one day be associated with the Trojan War, heroic cycles, or divine genealogies are not attested in this era. What can be said is that the social and cultural environment now allows oral material to circulate more widely than before. The growth of long-distance contact further facilitated the movement of traditions. Imported goods, similarities in pottery design, and the spread of certain cultural practices indicate that exchange between communities was becoming more frequent. This increased interaction laid the foundation for broader cultural convergence, an important prerequisite for the eventual emergence of a more unified Greek mythological framework. The evidence from burial customs also reflects social stabilization. Cemeteries from this period show standardized burial practices within individual communities, though variation remained across regions. Grave goods again became more common compared to earlier centuries, including pottery, bronze items, and occasionally imported materials. The return of richer burials in some areas indicates improved economic conditions and the re-emergence of social hierarchy. However, burial evidence does not provide information about specific myths or religious narratives. It only shows that ritual treatment of the dead remained an important aspect of community life. The absence of writing during this period is a defining factor in understanding the limitations of historical reconstruction. Greek literacy did not reappear until the late 9th or early 8th century BC with the adoption of the alphabet. Therefore, the oral traditions circulating in this period remain inaccessible to modern scholarship. We cannot identify content, structure, or specific themes. The only reliable conclusion is that communities preserved memory through spoken forms, and that increased interaction allowed these traditions to gradually become more compatible across regions. Religious iconography during this period is minimal. Geometric patterned pottery dominates artistic expression, and the abstract motifs offer no identifiable narrative content. Scenes depicting humans, animals, or possible ritual actions remain rare and stylized. As a result, the archaeological record does not provide material evidence of mythological narratives. The development of figural art in pottery will appear later in the 8th century BC, outside the time frame of this segment. The century between 900 and 800 BC is not characterized by dramatic change, but by steady, incremental developments that prepared the ground for later historical transformations. Communities became more stable. Trade networks slowly expanded. Ritual practices became more organized. Interregional contact grew more frequent. Oral tradition gained opportunities to circulate. These trends gradually shifted Greece from the isolation and fragmentation of the early Dark Age toward an environment capable of sustaining larger cultural systems. By 800 BC, Greece was approaching a threshold. Settlements were larger. Sanctuaries had become focal points of ritual life. Interaction between communities was more regular. A handful of sites showed early indications of architectural experimentation with cult buildings. Social organization had begun to cohere, though formal political structures remained in the future. These developments created the cultural and structural foundation that would allow the next major shift in Greek history: the return of writing and the eventual stabilization of myth through oral poetic tradition. Between 800 and 750 BC, Greece entered a phase in which long-evolving oral traditions began stabilizing into more structured narrative forms. This was not the creation of mythology, but the moment when centuries of orally transmitted stories started to solidify into coherent epic frameworks. The key development enabling this stabilization was the return of writing to Greece through the adoption of the alphabet adapted from Phoenician script. Writing returned on a limited scale, used primarily for short inscriptions, dedicatory markings, and administrative notations. Despite its limited use, the presence of writing introduced the possibility, though not immediate realization, of fixing oral compositions into a durable form. This period is commonly associated with the emergence of the tradition represented by Homer, though the historical identity of Homer remains unknown. The Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, cannot be dated with precision, but most scholarship places their composition in the late 8th or early 7th century BC, making the period between 800 and 750 BC the developmental stage in which the underlying oral material reached the level of complexity, structure, and formulaic density that would later characterize the epic tradition. It is essential to distinguish between the development of the oral poems and the existence of written texts. The poems were the product of generations of oral performance long before they were ever written down. The adoption of alphabetic writing did not result in widespread literacy. It remained confined to small segments of society, largely individuals involved in ritual dedication, trade, and craftsmanship. The earliest Greek inscriptions, such as short texts found on pottery, jewelry, or votive objects, demonstrate the practical use of writing but do not provide evidence of extensive literary activity. These inscriptions typically consist of single words, ownership marks, or brief phrases. Their existence indicates familiarity with the alphabet, but not its application to long-form composition at this early stage. Despite the limited use of writing, the cultural landscape of this period made the stabilization of oral epic more feasible. Communities had grown in size since the earlier Dark Age, and interregional connections were stronger. The development of shared sanctuaries and increased mobility provided contexts in which oral performers could travel and present narratives to diverse audiences. As oral poets encountered new listeners, the circulation of traditional stories enabled a gradual convergence of previously localized traditions. This convergence did not create a unified mythological canon, but established broad frameworks that would later be formalized in epic poetry. The oral tradition at this time employed a highly developed system of formulaic composition, a technique that allowed poets to create long, metrically structured narratives through the use of repeated phrases, stock scenes, and traditional patterns. This technique evolved over centuries of oral performance. By the 8th century BC, formulaic composition had reached a level at which large, coherent narrative cycles could be performed with stability across different recitations. This stability does not imply identical versions, but indicates that repeated performances shaped a consistent narrative structure within each poet's tradition. The society described in the emerging Homeric tradition reflects a combination of elements drawn from the Bronze Age, the Dark Age, and the Early Iron Age, rather than the lived world of any single historical period. For example, references to large palaces and elite warrior culture echo Mycenaean memory, while descriptions of iron tools reflect the realities of the 8th century BC. This mixture shows that oral tradition preserved fragments of earlier eras without maintaining precise historical accuracy. Therefore, the world presented in the Homeric epic represents a poetic reconstruction, not a historical record. It is important not to treat Homer's poems as the definitive account of Greek mythology at this stage. Even after the epics became influential, regional variation persisted. Communities across Greece maintained local cult practices, genealogies, and traditions that differed from those referenced in the epics. The influence of Homeric poetry grew over time, eventually shaping many aspects of Greek cultural identity. But during the period between 800 and 750 BC, its reach was limited to the contexts in which trained oral poets performed. A fully pan-Hellenic mythological framework would only develop gradually, influenced by subsequent authors and institutions. The emergence of communal sanctuaries also played a role in the spread of oral tradition. Large sanctuaries such as Olympia and Delphi were becoming more active during this period, though they had not yet reached the pan-Hellenic prominence that would define later centuries. These sanctuaries attracted visitors from nearby regions, creating opportunities for oral poets to perform before diverse audiences. The exchange of stories, rituals, and cultural practices across regional boundaries contributed to the growing coherence of the mythological landscape. However, this process was gradual, and the influence of sanctuaries on myth was indirect. Sanctuaries were centers of ritual activity, not literary institutions. The development of long-distance trade also facilitated cultural interaction. Greek communities engaged in maritime exchange with regions such as Phoenicia, Syria, and Cyprus, as evidenced by imported goods, artistic influences, and the adoption of the alphabet. These interactions did not introduce new myths directly, but they contributed to a broader cultural environment in which symbolic systems, artistic motifs, and ritual practices could circulate. The exchange of goods and ideas strengthened interregional connectivity, reinforcing the conditions under which oral traditions could spread and stabilize. The Homeric poems reflect, in their structural elements, a tradition shaped by centuries of oral performance. Features such as the use of dactylic hexameter, formulaic phrases, and repeated narrative scenes indicate that the poets who developed these works were trained within well-established performance systems. These systems allowed performers to create long, complex narratives without reliance on written texts. The presence of a stable metrical framework provided a structure within which stories could be shaped and transmitted across generations. The transition from oral composition to written version, likely occurring after the period covered in this segment, was not a single event. Scholars generally agree that the fixation of the Homeric poems into written form took place over a prolonged period, possibly involving multiple performers and scribes. The earliest stages of this process involve the increasing regularity of narrative structure, facilitated by the cultural cohesion developing between Greek communities. Writing provided a means to preserve long compositions, but it did not initially determine their content or shape. During this period, Greek communities were beginning to form the early stages of the polis, or city-state. though fully developed political institutions had not yet emerged. The growth of communal identity within settlements contributed to the conditions under which shared cultural traditions could become more prominent. As communities established leadership structures and communal gathering spaces, the social environment supported collective participation in ritual and storytelling. These shared experiences formed the groundwork for the later development of unified mythological narratives. The epics attributed to Homer would eventually exert substantial influence on Greek religion and culture, but during the window between 800 and 750 BC, their impact remained limited to specific performance contexts. The oral tradition that formed these epics existed within a society that was increasingly interconnected but still regionally diverse. No single narrative framework dominated Greece at this time. Instead, diverse local traditions continued to coexist alongside the evolving epic material. The earliest alphabetic inscriptions provide evidence that writing was used to mark ownership, dedicate objects, or record brief phrases. They do not indicate the existence of written literature. The poems associated with Homer were still performed orally and would continue to circulate orally even after writing became more common. The fixation of epic material in written form belongs to the later 8th or early 7th century BC and beyond, outside the scope of this segment. By 750 BC, Greece had reached a cultural threshold. Regional interaction had increased. Oral traditions had become more stable through repeated performance. Sanctuaries had begun to serve as hubs for inter-community gatherings. The alphabet existed, though literacy remained limited. The epic tradition was nearing the point at which its narrative structure would be recognizable in the form later preserved in written versions of the Iliad and Odyssey. This period, therefore, marks the decisive transition from the fragmented oral traditions of earlier centuries to a coherent, influential narrative framework that would dominate Greek cultural identity for centuries. Between 750 and 650 BC, Greek society underwent a series of changes that reshaped cultural expression and expanded the frameworks through which communities understood their gods, their origins, and their social order. This period marks the emergence of Hesiod, the earliest Greek poet whose work survives in relatively continuous form. His two major poems, Theogony and Works and Days, represent the first systematic attempt to organize the diverse and regionally varied oral traditions of earlier centuries into coherent structures. Although these poems are not historical records of ancient belief, they serve as the earliest surviving literary documents that present a comprehensive cosmology and genealogy for the Greek gods. Hesiod himself remains a figure about whom little can be known with certainty. Later ancient sources place him in Boeotia, and internal references in his poetry indicate familiarity with that region and with agricultural life. However, these references do not confirm biographical details. The poems attributed to him were preserved through oral and written transmission over centuries, meaning that their final form cannot be attributed to a single moment or a single act of authorship. Scholars generally place Hesiod's activity in the late 8th or early 7th century BC, during the same broad era in which the epic tradition associated with Homer took shape. His work emerges from a cultural environment where writing had reappeared but remained limited, and where oral performance continued to dominate the transmission of narrative. The Theogony represents the earliest extensive attempt in Greek literature to present a structured account of the origins of the cosmos and the genealogy of the gods. Earlier Greek tradition contained many local myths, cult stories, and divine names. But these traditions existed in fragmentary and regionally specific forms. The theogony does not invent these traditions. Rather, it organizes them into a linear sequence that traces the emergence of divine beings from primordial entities to the establishment of Zeus's authority. This organization reflects a move towards systematization that corresponds with broader developments in archaic Greece, where the formation of early city-states and the growth of communal institutions encouraged more structured understandings of social and cosmic order. It is important to emphasize that the theogony is a poetic synthesis, not a theological or cultic document. Its genealogy does not necessarily correspond to how specific gods were worshipped in local sanctuaries. For example, cult practices for Hera at Argos, Athena at Athens, or Apollo at Delphi developed independently of Hesiod's narrative. The poem serves to organize divine relationships conceptually, but it does not prescribe ritual practice or doctrine. Greek religion remained decentralized, with local variations in worship that continued throughout antiquity. The Works and Days, Hesiod's other major surviving poem, provides a different type of insight into the period. While the theogony focuses on divine genealogy, Works and Days anchors mythic references within the context of agricultural instruction, social norms, and seasonal cycles. The poem includes references to earlier ages of humanity, stories of labor and divine justice, and advice for managing agricultural tasks. However, these references are embedded within a practical framework rather than presented as standalone narratives. The poem reflects the concerns of small-scale agrarian communities in archaic Greece, where seasonal rhythms and local disputes shaped daily life. The cultural environment of 750 to 650 BC helps explain why works like those attributed to Hesiod emerge at this time. Greek communities were developing more formal political structures, though still in early stages. The rise of the polis brought increased communal cohesion, clearer distinctions in leadership roles, and growing interest in organizing social relationships within communities. Sanctuaries became more prominent as centers of ritual activity and communal identity. In this setting, literary attempts to impose order on inherited traditions align with the broader trend toward structural organization in social and political life. The role of writing in Hesiod's work remains difficult to determine. Alphabetic writing had been adopted by Greek communities by the late 8th century BC, but its use was limited predominantly to short inscriptions. The composition of long poems such as Theogony and Works and Days would still have depended primarily on oral performance. Written copies may have circulated at some point, but the stability of the poems resulted from repeated performance, not from immediate written fixation. Thus, while writing enabled greater preservation over time, oral tradition remained the primary medium of composition and transmission during this period. The theogony also reflects the influence of broader cultural exchange. Greek communities in the 8th and 7th centuries BC had renewed contact with regions such as Phoenicia, Syria, and Mesopotamia, leading to the introduction of new artistic motifs, technological practices, and symbolic forms. While the theogony should not be interpreted as a direct borrowing from Near Eastern texts, some structural parallels exist between Greek and Near Eastern cosmologies, such as genealogical succession and divine conflict. These parallels indicate that Greek poets operated in a cultural environment in which ideas circulated across regions, but they do not establish direct dependence or shared narrative origin. Hesiod's organizational approach reflects a developing interest in systematization across Greek society. The genealogical structure of the theogony provides a clear sequence of generations, relationships, and transitions in divine authority. This organization contrasts with the more fluid and episodic nature of earlier oral tradition. By arranging divine beings in hierarchical order, the poem offers a conceptual map for understanding the divine world, even if actual worship practices remain diverse and localized. This conceptual clarity contributed to the poem's long-term influence, even as variations of myths persisted across regions. During this period, Greek communities were also expanding in scale and complexity. Settlements became more stable, sanctuaries gained prominence, and the early stages of Greek colonization began, particularly in areas such as Sicily, southern Italy, and the Black Sea region. These developments increased the need for cultural frameworks that could travel with communities and provide shared reference points across distances. The theogony, with its clear genealogical structure, offered one such framework. Although it did not unify Greek myth entirely, it provided a recognizable foundation for later poets, artists, and thinkers. The Archaic period also saw increased production of figural art, particularly in pottery, sculpture, and small votive offerings. While early depictions do not illustrate the complex mythic narratives found in later classical art, they show an expanding visual vocabulary for representing gods, heroes, and symbolic scenes. The cultural environment in which Hesiod's poems circulated thus included both literary and visual developments that contributed to the gradual shaping of Greek mythological identity. Despite its influence, the theogony did not eliminate regional variation. Local cults maintained their own traditions, genealogies, and ritual practices. The poem offered a literary framework rather than a prescriptive one. Communities continued to worship gods according to local customs, and many regional deities not included in Hesiod's genealogy remained important in specific areas. This balance between literary structure and local diversity characterizes Greek religion throughout its history. The works and days provides valuable insight into the everyday world of early archaic Greece. Its emphasis on labor, justice, and agricultural timing reflects the concerns of communities adjusting to new social structures. The poem's references to divine justice and the consequences of human behavior illustrate the blending of mythic tradition with practical instruction. However, these references cannot be interpreted as systematic theology. They serve to contextualize social norms within a larger cosmic framework. By 650 BC, the influence of Hesiod's works had begun to spread. Poets, rhapsodes, and local performers used these texts as reference points for organizing and presenting mythic material. Artistic representations increasingly drew from the genealogical frameworks articulated in the theogony. Philosophical and literary figures in later centuries would treat Hesiod's work as foundational, even though it did not unify all Greek tradition during its own period. Between 650 and 500 BC, Greek religion entered a transformative stage in which ritual practices, sanctuary architecture, civic identity, and artistic production expanded in scale, visibility, and organization. This period, known as the Archaic Age, marked the transition from small community shrines and loosely coordinated cult practices to the emergence of monumental sanctuaries, formal priesthoods, and festival calendars tied to developing city-states. While myths themselves remained flexible and oral, this era provided the institutional and material framework through which myth became embedded in public life. The most visible evidence of this transformation is the rise of stone temple architecture. Early Greek sanctuaries before this period typically consisted of simple altars, small mud brick structures, or open-air spaces. Around the mid-7th century BC, communities began constructing more durable buildings using stone foundations, wooden columns, and terracotta roof tiles. By the 6th century BC, full stone temples appeared, exhibiting the early forms of the Doric and Ionic orders. These temples did not serve as gathering places for large congregations, but as houses for cult images and focal points for ritual offerings. Their increased size and architectural sophistication indicate a shift toward greater investment in religious institutions. Temple construction varied significantly by region. Corinth, Aegina, Samos, Miletus, and mainland Peloponnese showed early architectural development, each producing temples with distinct proportions and layouts. The Heraion of Samos, for example, demonstrates the scale possible by the mid-6th century BC, while earlier temples at Thermon, Corinth, and Aegina illustrate the transitional stages from wooden to stone components. These buildings reflect local experimentation rather than a unified architectural program. Sanctuaries became centers of regional interaction. Sites such as Olympia, Delphi, Isthmia, and Dodona expanded significantly during this period. Their growth was not yet pan-Hellenic in the full classical sense, but demonstrated increasing importance as meeting points for ritual, athletic, or consultative activities. The sanctuary at Olympia, for instance, housed an expanding altar to Zeus and saw the development of athletic competitions that would later be known as the Olympic Games. The sanctuary at Delphi grew in prominence as a site where communities sought oracular consultation. Dodona retained its status as one of the oldest Greek oracular centers, with ritual practices centered on sacred oaks and bronze tripods. These sanctuaries fostered interregional contact. Visitors from different communities brought offerings, consulted oracles, and participated in festivals. As a result, they became venues where local traditions met broader cultural currents. This did not produce a unified Greek religion, but facilitated the selective exchange of ideas, practices, and mythic references. Communication across regions increased the circulation of traditional stories, but no institution standardized myths for the entire Greek world. The rise of the polis, or city-state, played a central role in the institutionalization of myth. Between 650 and 500 BC, many Greek communities developed more formal civic structures, including councils, magistracies, and codified legal practices. These early political developments varied from region to region, but the overall trend was toward communities defining themselves as distinct social and political entities. Religion became an essential element of this civic identity. Each polis adopted specific patron deities, organized local festivals, and appointed officials responsible for maintaining cult practice. The connection between community and deity became more explicit, reinforcing religious identity as part of civic membership. Priesthoods remained local and often tied to specific families or hereditary lines. Unlike later philosophical or theological roles, archaic priests oversaw ritual procedure, maintained sanctuaries, and performed sacrifices. Their authority derived from tradition rather than doctrine. The rise of more formal civic institutions increased the visibility of the priesthoods, but did not create a centralized religious class. Cults continued to operate independently across regions. The institutionalization of festivals contributed significantly to the public role of myth. Many festivals emerged during this period or grew in prominence. They included processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and music or poetry performances. Although the narrative content of myths was not formally codified, festival contexts often provided opportunities for oral poets to present stories associated with gods and heroes. Over time, repeated festival performances helped stabilize aspects of mythic tradition, even without written standardization. Artistic production expanded dramatically during the Archaic Age, providing new opportunities for the depiction of mythic scenes. Black figure pottery, developed in Corinth in the 7th century BC and later adopted and expanded by Athens, became one of the primary media for representing mythological episodes. These scenes do not provide a consistent or authoritative mythic canon. Instead, artists selected and adapted episodes from a wide variety of traditions. The appearance of scenes involving divine figures, heroic encounters, or legendary settings indicates that myths were increasingly accessible, recognizable, and embedded in public visual culture. Sculpture also developed in scale and complexity. The emergence of kuroi, standing male statues, and kurai, standing female statues, reflects both religious dedication practices and evolving artistic techniques. These statues were often placed in sanctuaries as votive offerings or as markers of civic identity. Their form remained stylized, characterized by rigid posture and patterned hair, reflecting archaic artistic conventions rather than naturalistic representation. While not mythological in themselves, these statues demonstrate the growing public presence of religious dedication. Economic expansion contributed to the institutionalization of cult. Increased trade, particularly in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, brought wealth that communities invested in sanctuaries and public works. Coinage began appearing in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, facilitating economic exchange and enabling more systematic funding of temples and rituals. Colonization efforts, especially in southern Italy, Sicily, and the Black Sea, spread Greek religious practices abroad, establishing new sanctuaries that replicated or adapted those from the Greek mainland. Despite these developments, regional variation remained significant. For example, the Peloponnese favored large Doric temples earlier than some Aegean islands. Athens, though a major artistic center by the late 6th century BC, had not yet achieved the cultural dominance it would hold in the classical period. The diversity of cult practices across regions shows that Greek religion did not become uniform during the Archaic Age. Instead, local traditions continued alongside the growing influence of shared rituals and artistic forms. Myth and cult intersected in this period through public performance and artistic depiction, but they operated independently. Myths were transmitted through oral recitation, choral performances, or poetic competitions, while cult practices were expressed through sacrifices, processions, and rituals tied to local deities. The institutionalization of cult created consistent contexts in which myths could appear, but did not mandate their content. A story presented at one festival might differ from a version told elsewhere, and artistic depictions did not necessarily align with oral narratives. The Archaic Age also saw the expanding role of oracular consultation. The oracle at Delphi, in particular, became a focal point for political and personal decision-making. City-states sought guidance on matters such as colonization, warfare, and civic law. The increased influence of Delphi is visible in archaeological remains, inscriptions, and the dedication of monumental offerings. Although the oracle did not standardize myth, its prominence reinforced the authority of certain deities and the social importance of ritual consultation. By 500 BC, the developments of the Archaic Age had created a religious landscape in which myth, cult, art, and civic identity were deeply interconnected. Temples and sanctuaries stood as architectural markers of communal investment. Festivals structured civic calendars. Artistic production depicted gods and heroes in recognizable ways. Oral tradition, though still flexible, now circulated in contexts that encouraged convergence. Greek religion remained non-doctrinal and varied, but the institutional and material structures established during this period set the foundation for the more elaborate reinterpretations of myth that would occur in the classical era. Between 500 and 400 BC, Greek society saw significant developments in the public handling, reinterpretation, and institutionalization of myth. This century, known as the Classical period, produced extensive architectural, artistic, and literary evidence that transformed the cultural presence of myth without standardizing it. Myth remained flexible, adapted by theatrical performance, discussed by philosophical inquiry, and embedded within civic ritual. The changes of this era reshaped the visibility of myth in Greek life, but did not impose doctrinal uniformity or override long-standing regional diversity. The most prominent cultural shift of this period was the expansion of Athenian drama, particularly tragedy. Playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, active between approximately 472 and 406 BC, used traditional mythic material as the foundation for public performance during civic festivals. Their plays did not present authoritative versions of stories. Instead, they introduced reinterpretations, adjustments, or new emphases that varied from performance to performance. These variations reveal that myth in the classical period remained open to adaptation. Tragedy functioned within the context of the Dionysia, an Athenian festival honoring Dionysus, where citizens and visiting audiences witnessed dramatized narratives based on familiar traditions. The civic setting of these performances made myth publicly visible, but not fixed. Tragedy also illustrates the distinction between myth and cult. While plays used mythic characters and settings, they did not dictate ritual practice or belief. Greek religion did not rely on doctrinal statements or authoritative texts, and the reinterpretations offered by playwrights did not alter or prescribe cult behavior. Shrines, temples, and sacrifices continued according to local tradition, independent of dramatic representation. The function of tragedy was ceremonial, educational in a civic sense, and artistic, but not theological. Athenian drama did not represent all of Greece. Although other polis had theatrical performances, Athens developed the most elaborate festival structures and produced the most surviving texts. As a result, modern understanding of classical drama centers on Athens, but this should not be taken to imply cultural dominance across the Greek world during the entire century. Other regions continued to maintain their own religious calendars, local cults, and variations of myth that did not necessarily align with Athenian dramatic interpretations. In addition to drama, The classical period saw the rise of early philosophical critiques of traditional mythic narratives. Thinkers such as Xenophanes of Colophon, active in the late 6th and early 5th centuries BC, questioned anthropomorphic portrayals of the gods. Xenophanes argued that depictions of divine behavior in traditional stories were inconsistent with his concept of divine perfection. These critiques did not attack cult practices. Ritual structures continued to function normally, and sanctuaries remained active across Greece. Philosophical reflection influenced the intellectual discourse surrounding myth, but did not alter cultic religion. Other philosophers, such as Heraclitus, also examined traditional narratives, though often in the context of broader discussions about nature and order. Their works demonstrate that Greek intellectual culture began to analyze traditional stories through rational inquiry. However, this analysis did not lead to a unified reinterpretation of myth. Instead, it reflects the diversity of thought characteristic of the classical period, in which poets, dramatists, philosophers, and civic institutions simultaneously engaged with traditional material in different ways. The classical era also witnessed major architectural developments that increased the visibility of myth in public spaces. Governments of various polis, particularly Athens, invested heavily in monumental building programs during this period. The most famous example is the Athenian Acropolis, rebuilt in the mid-5th century BC following the Persian Wars. Structures such as the Parthenon, Erechtheion, and Propylaea featured sculptural programs depicting mythic scenes on metopes, friezes, and pediments. These visual representations did not standardize myth, but served as civic art, expressing community identity and honoring the gods through monumental dedication. Outside Athens, sanctuaries across Greece underwent similar expansion. At Olympia, construction continued on major temples, including the Temple of Zeus, completed around 457 BC, which housed a chryselephantine statue by Phidias. At Delphi, treasuries built by various city-states displayed mythic scenes associated with their local traditions. At Ephesus and Samos, temples dedicated to Artemis were enlarged or reconstructed using advanced architectural techniques. These building projects show that investment in sanctuaries remained a primary means for communities to express civic identity and foster interregional presence. The role of sanctuaries in the classical period extended beyond ritual. They served as locations for athletic festivals, political consultation, and the dedication of war spoils. Myth played a role in the symbolism of these activities, but not as a formal doctrine. For example, the sanctuary at Delphi continued to attract consultation from city-states seeking guidance on public matters. The oracle's authority derived from tradition, not from a standardized mythological canon. Its responses, recorded sporadically through inscriptions or later historical accounts, reveal the continued importance of ritual and tradition rather than a shift toward philosophical or literary reinterpretation. During this period, Greek city-states developed more formal governmental structures. These political advancements shaped civic religion by formally integrating cult practices into state operations. City-states maintained public officials responsible for overseeing sacrifices, festivals, and temple administration. These officials did not enforce doctrine, but ensured the regular performance of civic rituals. Public calendars listed festival dates, and sacrifices were funded by state resources. The increased integration of religion into civic life further institutionalized cult practice, but did not eliminate local variation. The classical period also saw the expansion of public festivals as essential components of civic identity. Festivals reinforced political cohesion, commemorated historical events, and provided structured settings for ritual. The Panathenaic festival in Athens, for example, included athletic competitions, musical contests, and processions culminating in the dedication of a woven peplos to Athena. Despite the presence of mythic references in festival activities, the events focused on ritual procedure rather than narrative interpretation. Festivals amplified the public presence of myth, but did not standardize its content. Artistic production during this century became more detailed and varied. Red figure pottery, replacing the black figure technique around 530 BC, allowed painters to depict human and divine figures with greater detail. Pottery scenes show episodes drawn from a wide range of traditions, including heroic encounters, divine interactions, and well-known narrative sequences. However, these depictions represent artistic choices rather than authoritative accounts. The flexibility of myth remained intact, as artists selected, modified, or combined episodes according to aesthetic preference. Sculpture evolved as well. The transition from archaic kuroi and kurai to classical forms brought increased naturalism and anatomical accuracy. Sculptures placed in sanctuaries, such as bronze statues dedicated by victorious athletes, contributed to the visual environment surrounding cult practice. While some statues depicted mythic figures, many served commemorative or votive functions unrelated to specific stories. The coexistence of mythic and non-mythic imagery illustrates the multifaceted role of art in classical religious life. Despite the prominence of Athens in surviving sources, other regions maintained distinct traditions. In Sparta, religious practice emphasized musical festivals, local hero cults, and venerable traditions associated with the Dioscuri. In Thebes, cults of Dionysus and local hero figures remained significant. In southern Italy and Sicily, Greek colonies developed hybrid forms of cult practice influenced by local populations. These regional differences highlight that Greek religion during the classical period did not converge into a single system. The century between 500 and 400 BC also included major historical events, the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, that affected religious practice. After conflicts, communities offered dedications to sanctuaries, consulted oracles, or performed purification rituals. While mythic symbols sometimes appeared in commemorative monuments, these references represented civic expression rather than doctrinal interpretation. By 400 BC, Greek society possessed a highly developed system of civic religion, public festivals, monumental architecture, and diverse artistic representations of myth. Drama provided a platform for reinterpretation. Philosophy offered critique and reflection. Civic religion maintained ritual continuity. Sanctuaries facilitated interregional communication. Despite these developments, Greek religion remained decentralized and non-doctrinal. No single authority has defined myth. Local traditions persisted alongside widely recognized stories, and variation remained a hallmark of Greek cultural life. Between 400 and 200 BC, Greek religion entered a period of wide geographic diffusion, cultural interaction, and institutional evolution. This era, known as the Hellenistic period, followed the conquests of Alexander the Great and the fragmentation of his territories into successor states. As Greek language, artistic forms, and administrative practices spread across regions stretching from Egypt to Central Asia, Greek myth and cult traditions traveled with them. These traditions did not displace local religions. Instead, they coexisted, interacted, and, in some cases, merged in structured or pragmatic ways. Syncretism, scholarly systematization, and expanded artistic representation reshaped the presence of myth in a multicultural world while leaving traditional Greek cult practice intact. The rise of Alexander the Great in the mid-4th century BC created conditions for Greek cultural expansion on an unprecedented scale. His campaigns brought Greek-speaking populations into contact with Persian, Egyptian, Phoenician, and Central Asian cultures. Alexander did not pursue a deliberate program of religious export, nor did he attempt to impose Greek gods upon conquered regions. Instead, Greek soldiers, administrators, settlers, and merchants carried their traditions as they moved throughout the newly established cities and military colonies. These Greeks built sanctuaries dedicated to familiar deities such as Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and Artemis, while encountering long-standing local cults that continued uninterrupted. After Alexander died in 323 BC, his territory was divided into several independent kingdoms, including the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East, and the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia. Each kingdom combined Greek administrative structures with regional traditions. This political fragmentation prevented the emergence of any unified religious system. Instead, it produced localized adaptations in which Greek deities appeared alongside Near Eastern and Egyptian gods in varying degrees depending on region, city, and population density. One of the most significant developments of this period was the rise of syncretic cults, especially in Egypt. When the Ptolemies established their capital at Alexandria, they ruled over a population that included Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and other groups. To support political cohesion and administrative stability, the early Ptolemies promoted a new deity known as Serapis. Serapis did not originate as a simple fusion of Greek and Egyptian gods. Rather, he was created as a state-supported deity whose attributes could be recognized by multiple cultural communities. His cult incorporated elements familiar to Greek worshippers, such as anthropomorphic representation and temple structures, while also drawing on Egyptian religious symbolism and ritual context. Serapis became one of the most successful syncretic cult figures of the Hellenistic world, but his creation did not replace Egyptian religious traditions, which remained active and deeply rooted. Other regions experienced different forms of syncretism. Along the eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern coastline, Greek settlers encountered long-established cults dedicated to deities such as Baal, Melkart, and Astarte. In some cases, Greeks identified local gods with familiar Greek figures through a process later termed interpretatio Graeca. This identification did not imply equivalence or doctrinal merger, but provided a conceptual framework for cross-cultural understanding. Greek sanctuaries sometimes stood near local temples, and ritual calendars occasionally aligned for practical reasons, but Greek and local traditions continued to operate independently. The Hellenistic period also saw the emergence of major scholarly centers, particularly the Library and Mycenaean of Alexandria. These institutions supported the systematic study, cataloging, and comparison of Greek literary traditions. Scholars such as Callimachus, Xenodotus, and Aristophanes of Byzantium worked to organize earlier epic, genealogical, and poetic material. Their efforts did not produce a standardized canon of myth. Instead, They preserved variant traditions, commented on inconsistencies, and maintained multiple versions of stories. Their work reflects the recognition that Greek myth had no single authoritative form. The scholarly environment of Alexandria provided tools for comparing traditions rather than unifying them. Other centers, such as Pergamon, developed significant libraries and artistic schools that further contributed to the preservation and reinterpretation of myth. These institutions encouraged the creation of new literary works, including epic poems, choral compositions, and scholarly treatises that drew on traditional material. Hellenistic poets often reinterpreted earlier myths in innovative ways, reflecting the creativity characteristic of the period. These reworkings did not alter cult practice, but shaped the literary legacy through which later generations would understand Greek myth. Religious practice in Hellenistic cities remained anchored in traditional forms. Temples, altars, and sanctuaries continued to function as centers of ritual life. Many cities maintained patron deities linked to earlier traditions, and festivals preserved local calendars. Greek religion in this era did not become centralized or doctrinal. Instead, it adapted to regional conditions while retaining core structures such as sacrifice, procession, and dedication. Priests continued to be selected through local traditions, and civic institutions supported festival administration. While syncretic cults expanded, they operated alongside established practices without displacing them. Art in the Hellenistic period achieved new levels of technical sophistication and expressive detail. Sculptural styles featured more dynamic poses, realistic anatomy, and complex compositions, reflecting advancements in technique and patronage. Mythological subjects became more varied, appearing in large-scale sculptures, architectural friezes, small terracotta figures, and elaborately decorated pottery. These depictions illustrate growing interest in both traditional and newly emerging mythic themes. Yet the increased realism and variety of representation did not imply a shift toward doctrinal interpretation. Artistic choices remained flexible and often depended on patron preference, local tradition, or aesthetic innovation. Cities founded by Alexander and his successors became centers of cultural exchange. Settlements such as Alexandria, Antioch, Seleucia, and Ai housed Greek, local, and mixed populations. Greek remained the administrative language, facilitating communication across regions, but local languages persisted alongside it. These multicultural environments fostered the coexistence of diverse religious practices. Greek sanctuaries often appeared near older local temples, each serving different communities or overlapping populations. The spread of Greek religious traditions also influenced funerary practices, household rituals, and civic commemorations. Funerary art across the Eastern Mediterranean began incorporating Greek stylistic elements, though local customs persisted. Household shrines in Greek-speaking communities often displayed small votive figurines representing Greek deities, reflecting personal piety rather than doctrinal adherence. Civic commemorations after military events frequently involved dedications to Greek gods, illustrating the role of religion in public life across Hellenistic territories. Although philosophical schools expanded during this period, most notably Stoicism, Epicureanism, and academic skepticism, their influence on cult practice remained limited. Stoics interpreted myths allegorically, connecting divine figures to natural or rational principles. Epicureans critiqued traditional narratives, but did not deny the existence of the gods. These philosophical developments represent intellectual engagement rather than religious revolution. Traditional cults continued to function, and sanctuaries remained active throughout the Hellenistic world. The political fragmentation of the successor states contributed to the diversity of religious expression. The Seleucid Empire, stretching across a vast and culturally varied region, managed a mosaic of Greek and local religious communities. The Ptolemies in Egypt oversaw temples dedicated to Greek deities while also supporting traditional Egyptian temple complexes, which continued to operate with their own priesthoods and architectural styles. The Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia maintained older Greek cult traditions rooted in local histories. No Hellenistic ruler imposed a uniform religious system. Instead, rulers often supported multiple traditions to reinforce political legitimacy among diverse populations. In regions farther east, Greek cultural presence blended with Central Asian traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Ai Khanum in modern Afghanistan reveals the presence of Greek architectural forms, inscriptions, and artistic motifs. These features coexisted with local practices, illustrating the adaptability of Greek culture in non-Mediterranean environments. While the gods depicted in Greek art at these sites often follow traditional iconography, their presence reflects cultural interaction rather than religious dominance. By 200 BC, the Greek-speaking world had expanded significantly, encompassing populations from Egypt to the Hindu Kush. Greek myths circulated widely through art, literature, and performance, but their meaning and interpretation varied by region. Syncretism became a defining feature of the era, not as a coherent theological program, but as a practical response to multicultural environments. Local religious traditions remained strong, and Greek cult practices adapted rather than replaced existing systems. The Hellenistic period thus represents a phase in which myth became more globally visible while maintaining its flexibility and regional diversity. Between 200 BC and 100 AD, Greek mythology entered a new phase shaped by Roman rule, expanded literary activity, and increased preservation of earlier traditions. This period does not mark the creation of new foundational myths, nor the decline of Greek religion, but rather a stage in which Greek mythic material was collected, reorganized, translated, and adapted across a wider cultural sphere. Greek cult practice remained active and regionally distinct, even as Roman authors disseminated Greek stories through Latin literature and Roman institutions integrated Greek cultural forms into public and private life. The result was not homogenization, but broader accessibility and documentation of Greek mythic traditions. Following Rome's expansion into the eastern Mediterranean during the 2nd century BC, Greek-speaking regions came under Roman political control while retaining autonomy in local governance, cult administration, and civic religious customs. Greek sanctuaries continued operating with traditional priesthoods, and local festivals remained tied to long-established ritual calendars. Roman officials did not impose new doctrines, nor did they attempt to restructure Greek religion. Instead, Greek cults persisted as part of the broader cultural landscape of the Roman Mediterranean, and their visibility increased as Roman elites traveled, studied, and patronized Greek institutions. One of the defining characteristics of this period is the Roman literary engagement with Greek myth. Roman poets, historians, and scholars reworked Greek material into Latin forms, often adapting traditional narratives to new contexts while preserving elements of earlier stories. This process did not fix myth in authoritative forms. Rather, it expanded the range of versions available to later generations. Among the most influential Roman authors was Ovid, whose Metamorphoses, composed near the end of the 1st century BC, organized a wide array of Greek and non-Greek myths into a continuous narrative centered on transformation. Ovid drew on earlier Greek sources, including Hellenistic poetry and classical mythographers, but his work represents a literary synthesis rather than a historical or doctrinal compilation. His interpretations reflect Roman poetic priorities, not authoritative Greek tradition. Nevertheless, the Metamorphoses became one of the most comprehensive surviving repositories of Greek mythic material because of its broad scope and textual preservation. Another important figure was Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian writing in the 1st century BC. His Bibliotheca Historica includes mythic genealogies, heroic cycles, and local traditions drawn from earlier Greek sources. Diodorus attempted to organize disparate material into a universal history. His method combined myth with ethnography and local accounts without attempting to impose a unified system. His work demonstrates the continued Greek interest in preserving local and regional traditions even under Roman rule. The Library of Alexandria, founded during the Hellenistic period, remained active under Roman administration. Scholars continued to compile, edit, and compare earlier Greek literature. Their work contributed to the preservation of multiple textual variants, commentaries, and catalogs that documented different versions of myths. The Alexandrian scholarly tradition treated myth as a literary subject, not as a religious doctrine. This distinction ensured the survival of competing accounts rather than the promotion of a single authoritative version. Another key text from this period is the library, Bibliotheca, attributed to Apollodorus, likely written by a later author, now referred to as the Pseudo-Apollodorus. Composed around the 1st or 2nd century AD, but based on earlier material, the work offers a structured summary of Greek mythic genealogy and narrative sequences. Although compact, it reflects a long tradition of mythographic organization. The library does not attempt to harmonize contradictions or eliminate regional variation. Instead, it preserves an outline of traditional stories as they circulated in earlier centuries, providing one of the most accessible surviving summaries of Greek myth. Roman education played a significant role in transmitting Greek myth beyond the Greek-speaking world. Greek literature, especially Homer, became central to Roman elite education. Students studied Greek texts for rhetorical training and literary instruction. As a result, Greek myth entered Roman intellectual life and circulated widely through schools, libraries, and private collections. This educational emphasis contributed to the survival of Greek epic and poetic traditions, as manuscripts were copied, commentaries were written, and Greek texts became integral to Roman cultural identity. Roman art and architecture also incorporated Greek mythological themes. Public buildings, private villas, and decorative objects featured scenes derived from Greek narratives. These depictions varied widely and often reflected Roman aesthetic values rather than Greek cultic concerns. Frescoes in locations such as Pompeii and Herculaneum show mythic scenes rendered in stylistic forms characteristic of Roman domestic decoration. Sculptural works produced during this period frequently replicated or reinterpreted Greek originals. Roman artists created copies of classical and Hellenistic statues, ensuring the survival of Greek mythological iconography even when some original works were lost. While Roman visual culture expanded the presence of Greek myth, it did not transform Greek religion. Greek sanctuaries continued to host festivals, sacrifices, and dedications according to long-standing practices. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Delphi, Olympia, Dodona, and Epidaurus shows ongoing activity during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC and into the early Roman Empire. In many regions, Greek priesthoods remained hereditary, and city councils continued to manage cult finances and festival schedules. Local religious traditions maintained vitality, unaffected by Roman literary reinterpretations. The association of Greek gods with Roman counterparts represents another form of adaptation without convergence. Roman religion operated through a system of interpretatio Graeca, in which Romans identified their deities with those of other cultures to facilitate understanding. For example, Zeus was associated with Jupiter, Athena with Minerva, and Artemis with Diana. These associations reflected conceptual parallels rather than doctrinal equivalence. Greek and Roman cults maintained distinct rituals, iconography, and local traditions. The Greek understanding of Zeus, shaped by regional worship and mythic genealogy, did not collapse into the Roman conception of Jupiter, rooted in Roman state religion and civic identity. Roman rule also contributed to the preservation of Greek myth through infrastructure and administrative stability. Roads, trade networks, and urban development facilitated movement across the eastern Mediterranean. Greek festivals attracted visitors from wider regions, and sanctuaries benefited from increased travel and economic interaction. Roman patronage supported the maintenance of some sanctuaries, not for religious reform, but for cultural prestige. At the same time, Greek cities continued to manage their own religious affairs, demonstrating the resilience of local traditions. In literature, Latin retellings of Greek myths circulated alongside Greek texts, creating a broader multilingual corpus. These Latin adaptations did not replace Greek versions. Instead, they increased the range of interpretations available. Works such as Virgil's Aeneid, which incorporates elements of Greek mythic tradition into a Roman national epic, demonstrate how Greek material could be adapted to new contexts. Yet, even in such adaptations, Greek narratives were preserved, referenced, or transformed rather than discarded. By the late 1st century AD, Greek and Roman intellectuals produced a growing body of antiquarian and mythographic works. These texts sought to document local traditions, genealogies, and historical accounts of sanctuaries. Writers such as Strabo, a geographer active around the turn of the millennium, incorporated myth into broader descriptions of landscapes and regional customs. His work demonstrates that Greek myth continued to serve as a cultural reference point embedded within geographic and ethnographic commentary. Throughout this period, Greek religion remained active. Ritual calendars continued to function, sanctuaries remained central to civic identity, and local traditions persisted. Roman rule did not diminish these practices. Instead, it expanded the environment in which they operated. Greek religion would only enter a phase of decline in later centuries, primarily due to cultural and political transformations associated with late antiquity, well after the time frame covered in this segment. By 100 AD, Greek mythology had become more widely preserved, more accessible, and more extensively cataloged than at any earlier point. Roman literary engagement ensured the survival of stories that had previously existed only in oral or regionally specific contexts. Greek scholars maintained libraries and educational systems that sustained traditional narratives. Artists and architects produced works that extended Greek mythic imagery across the Mediterranean world. Despite these developments, Greek religion remained fundamentally decentralized and diverse. Roman adaptations expanded the visibility of Greek myth without imposing uniformity or doctrine. Between 100 and 400 AD, Greek religion underwent a gradual transformation. This era did not witness the sudden disappearance of traditional worship or the abrupt triumph of a new religious system. Instead, it represents a prolonged period of coexistence, adaptation, and eventual administrative restriction. Greek cults remained active for most of the first 3 centuries, operating within the institutional framework of the Roman Empire. Greek myths, meanwhile, continued to circulate through literature, education, art, and scholarly commentary, even as public ritual practice slowly diminished. By 400 AD, Greek cult worship had largely faded, but Greek mythology remained embedded within the intellectual and cultural life of the Mediterranean. In the early part of this period, roughly 100 to 250 AD, Greek religious life continued with substantial continuity. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries across the Greek mainland, the Aegean Islands, and Asia Minor demonstrates ongoing activity. Temples remained in use, sacrifices were performed, and festivals followed their traditional calendars. Local priesthoods continued to manage cult finances, oversee rituals, and maintain access to sanctuaries. Cities such as Athens, Delphi, Olympia, Priene, and Aphrodisias preserved long-standing traditions without interruption. Inscriptions from these regions record dedications, civic decrees related to festivals, and financial accounts associated with temple maintenance. These documents indicate that Greek religion remained an active and visible component of civic life. Roman administrators during this period generally supported traditional religious structures. The Roman Empire operated on a principle of accommodating local cults as long as they did not disrupt public order. Greek temples received imperial patronage in some cases, often as part of broader civic development projects. Emperors granted funds for repairs, renovations, or festival support, particularly in cities that maintained strong regional importance. This pattern of support demonstrates that the Roman state did not undermine Greek religion during the first 2 centuries AD. Instead, traditional cults continued to function as stable institutions within the empire. At the same time, Greek myth persisted in literary and educational contexts. Schools across the empire used Homeric texts as foundational material for rhetorical training. Students learned Greek through recitations, grammatical exercises, and interpretive commentaries on epic passages. Myth became part of an educational standard rather than a religious system. Philosophers, rhetoricians, and scholars referenced mythic episodes in their arguments or expositions, further embedding myth in intellectual culture. These uses separated myth from cult practice but ensured its continuity across generations. Greek art also continued to feature mythological themes. Sculptures, mosaics, frescoes, and reliefs depicted gods, heroes, and legendary scenes. Artistic representations from cities such as Aphrodisias, Ephesus, Delos, and Corinth show that mythic imagery remained popular in both public spaces and private residences. These depictions reflect aesthetic interest rather than doctrinal endorsement. They indicate that myths remained culturally significant even when not tied directly to ritual practice. During the mid-2nd to 3rd century AD, Greek religion began to encounter structural pressures that gradually reduced its institutional presence. These pressures were not primarily ideological. Instead, they arose from economic, administrative, and demographic changes. Urban decline in some regions reduced the resources available for temple maintenance. Earthquakes and other natural events damaged sanctuaries, and repairs were not always feasible. Civic budgets shifted toward different priorities as cities adapted to new political and economic realities. These changes weakened the infrastructure of traditional cults without directly suppressing them. In addition, philosophical movements of this period, including Middle Platonism and various schools of rhetorical thought, continued to reference myth in symbolic or allegorical ways. While these interpretations contributed to the intellectual appreciation of myth, they did not function as religious reforms. Cult practice remained distinct from philosophical discourse. Rather than replacing traditional worship, philosophical engagement provided alternative ways of understanding myth that coexisted with ritual activity. Christian communities began to grow during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, particularly in urban centers. This growth did not immediately threaten Greek religious practice. For much of this period, Christians formed small groups that operated separately from civic cults. Greek religion maintained legal recognition, public visibility, and state support. Christian texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries indicate that Christians lived alongside polytheistic communities, often interacting with them in everyday life. The expansion of Christianity did not involve widespread conflict or rapid shifts in religious practice during this stage. By the late 3rd century, administrative reforms under emperors such as Diocletian altered the political landscape of the empire. These reforms reorganized provincial boundaries, expanded imperial bureaucracy, and addressed economic instability. Greek sanctuaries continued to function, but the broader restructuring of the empire placed new administrative constraints on civic institutions. The cumulative effect contributed to the gradual weakening of public cults, though the rituals themselves persisted. Transition begins accelerating only in the 4th century AD. The reign of Constantine, 306 to 337 AD, is often associated with significant changes, but it is essential to avoid oversimplification. Constantine did not ban Greek religion, nor did he dismantle temples. He provided imperial favor to Christianity, allowing it to expand more quickly, but he continued traditional practices such as consulting oracles earlier in his career. Temples remained open, sacrifices continued, and local priesthoods retained authority throughout much of the century. The shift during the 4th century was gradual and administrative in nature. As Christian communities grew in size and influence, civic resources began to shift toward Christian institutions. Imperial patronage supported the construction of churches, while some traditional festivals lost state funding. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence show reduced activity in certain sanctuaries by the mid-4th century, though others remained active. This variation reflects regional differences rather than a uniform decline. The legislative turning point for Greek cult worship occurred late in the 4th century under Theodosius I, whose decrees between 391 and 392 AD restricted sacrifices and closed certain temples. These laws did not erase Greek religion instantly, but they signaled the end of its public institutional support. Since the time frame of this segment ends at 400 AD, these decrees mark the boundary of the transition. After this point, Greek cults diminished rapidly in many regions due to a lack of state support, though private practices may have continued informally. Throughout this period, Greek myths remained resilient. Their survival did not depend on cult activity. Instead, myths persisted through literary texts, copied in schools and libraries, educational curricula centered on Homer and classical poetry, rhetorical training, which relied on myth as a source of examples, scholia and commentaries, which preserved older interpretive traditions, artistic representation, particularly in mosaics and decorative sculpture. Christian authors also contributed indirectly to the preservation of Greek myth. Apologists and theologians cited Greek stories as examples or contrasts, requiring familiarity with mythic material. This engagement ensured that Greek myths remained part of intellectual discourse even as cult practice declined. By 400 AD, public Greek cult worship had largely diminished across the empire. Temples stood unused or repurposed, festivals ceased to operate widely, and priesthoods lost their civic function. Yet Greek myth remained fully intact within literary and educational frameworks. The survival of Homer, Hesiod, tragedy, Hellenistic poetry, and Roman adaptations ensured that the mythological tradition would endure far beyond the lifespan of the religion that originally supported it.